Welcome back to our next lesson as we work our way through Duties of Christian Fellowship, written by the great Puritan John Owen. We come here in our fifth lesson to the fourth rule that Owen lays down as it chiefly applies to a congregant's duty to his or her pastor. So we've worked our way through the first three rules. We just have four more in relation to how congregants ought to, the duties required of them towards their pastor. And then Owen, in the last half of the book, looks at our duties one to another in Christian fellowship. And so the fourth rule that Owen lays down here in his wonderful little book is that believers are to hold the pastor in the greatest respect and to submit to him for the work's sake. Right? So Owen here shows that pastors, that those who minister the gospel ought to be revered, and that they ought to be held in the highest honor. Now, Owen gives a number of proof texts here, but we see this in the New Testament clearly. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 1, "This is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and as stewards of the mysteries of God." Similarly, in 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 12 and 13, Paul wrote, "We ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord and admonish you, and to esteem them very highly in love because of their work." In 1 Timothy 5:17, "Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching." And so we see that the pattern in the New Testament that Paul lays down is that those who minister the word, that those who are pastors or elders, they ought to be held in the highest regard and greatest respect by the congregants that they serve. The congregants ought to submit to them as unto the Lord. Now, as Owen explains this, his explanation is very simple and it's very straightforward. He notes for us that the type of respect that pastors and elders deserve is a very civil respect and an esteem for them, but that it is derived from a very sacred motive. So he says a civil respect and a sacred motive. Now, what Owen stresses here as he begins his explanation is that our respect for pastors will inevitably reflect something of the grace of the church. All right, so if you can just imagine this illustration where somebody speaks disrespectfully of their pastor, or they discredit their pastor, or they kind of brush them to the side and let people know that they don't really like their pastor. Right? Owen says that will inevitably reflect something about the church. How much more devastating this is when pastors are degraded in the presence of non-Christians. Right? This does nothing to boost the glory and the beauty of the church that Christ has left behind. So we note here, that Owen says in his explanation that the way in which we respect or don't respect our pastors are going to reflect something of the grace and the charity of the church itself. Now, most of Owen's explanation is taken up by simply saying that we should consider all the different names or the titles that ministers are given, particularly in the New Testament, though he does draw connections in the Old Testament as well. Listen to this list of what Owen draws out. He says that ministers, the pastors of the gospel, that they're referred to as angels. Now, this isn't necessarily a popular view today, but Owen, the proof texts that he cites here are Revelation chapter 1, verse 20, and Hebrews chapter 12, verse 22. And Owen is working with this common idea back in his day and age, particularly that as the angels were writing their letters to the church in Ephesus there, that those angels were actually the ministers. Angel simply means a messenger, one who declares something, and so it was very common amongst the Puritans to draw connections between angels and ministers. And so Owen notes here that ministers receive the title of angel in the New Testament. But similarly, and this is not as disputed, particularly within Presbyterianism, the ministers are often referred to as bishops or overseers. Right? The Greek word that's translated either as bishop or overseer, it's the exact same word, but that we are told that they have this overseeing position, right? That they are bishops, that they are elders, that they ought to be respected as is becoming an elder. Similarly, we're told over and over again from the pen of the Apostle Paul that ministers are servants. You think of the way in which Paul introduced so many of his letters, that he wrote as a servant or a slave of Christ Jesus, right? That this was a designation that he had, a very high and profitable title as he was writing to the churches. Similarly, Paul notes that he and fellow ministers, that they are ambassadors of God. We've talked about that in a previous lesson, that the minister doesn't share his own opinions or his own thoughts, but he shares the word of Christ, that he is simply an instrument, the vehicle, that he is an ambassador who represents somebody else. And as an ambassador, Owen says here that ambassadors deserve the highest honor. And as ministers are known as ambassadors of God and of Christ, so they ought to be held in high honor. Similarly, Paul designates himself and ministers as stewards of the mysteries of God. And we saw that in one of the proof texts in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 1. Right now, the mysteries of God here are typically taken to refer to the proclamation of the gospel through the word and the sacraments. We won't get into a full-fledged defense of that at the present moment, but as Paul says, we are stewards of the mysteries of God. Right, this is the revelation of Christ, that ministers have been entrusted with opening and unfolding the glorious realities of who Christ is. And they do this as stewards. They've been entrusted with this very valuable and glorious mission. Similarly, ministers are referred to as men or man of God. Paul, as he was writing to the young minister Timothy, he declares to him, he says, "But as for you, O man of God, flee these things." And Owen sees in that a particular title for Timothy there, for Timothy as standing as a pastor. So not just a general declaration of all Christians, but particularly in his pastoral role there. We are told in the book of Hebrews that our ministers and elders, that they are leaders and that we must submit to them. And the idea of leading here, undoubtedly, as some lexicons point out, has the understanding of authoritative leadership. Right? They're not just leaders in the sense that they are signposts that point in a good direction, but that it does come with authority. We looked at that in the second lesson under the first rule that Owen gave. And then we again see this even as Paul encourages Titus, who himself was a minister. He says that Titus must rebuke with all authority. All right, Titus's leadership role came with authority, and he was to exert that when necessary. Another common title that's given to ministers is that of fathers. As Paul was commending himself in a God-glorifying way in 1 Corinthians 4, verse 15, right? Paul tells to them, you don't have many spiritual fathers. And he's effectively saying, but that is what I am to you. Similarly, as he characterizes his ministry among the Thessalonians, Paul reminds the Thessalonians that he had taken care of them as a tender mother cares for and nurses her child. All right, so Paul notes here that the role of a minister is also a motherly role, a tender mother that nurses. Several verses later in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 11, not just dealing with the mother metaphor, but now dealing with the fatherly metaphor, Paul says, and you also know how we admonished you every day as fathers. So part of the role of the minister is that he plays a spiritual role of spiritual mother and spiritual father. And just as the fifth commandment teaches us to honor our father and our mother in the physical sense, so we are called to honor our fathers and mothers in our spiritual sense as our ministers and elders shepherd us in that way. And so with all of these names, all these titles or designations, Owen notes for us that ministers, pastors are to be held in the highest respect by their congregants. Owen notes this, and I quote, he says, "If according to these names they honor God as they ought, then God will also honor them as he has promised. And God's people, in all conscience, are to esteem them highly for their works' sake." End quote. So John Owen notes here that when ministers walk faithfully to these titles that they have, that God will honor them, and that the people should honor them as well. So here we have this fourth rule, that believers are to hold the pastor in the greatest respect and to submit to him for the work's sake. I just want to address a couple practical issues. Owen himself doesn't deal with these, but again, I think this is a helpful supplement to what Owen has given to us. I think, that as Owen gives us this rule that ministers are to be held in highest regard, this is a particular challenge in our day and age. Right? We live in a culture where Christian pastors are often characterized as effeminate, or they're characterized as weak or docile, or out of touch with the world around them. You think perhaps of well-known television shows or movies where pastors are characterized, and rarely are they seen as estimable or as commendable people. But usually they're characterized in stereotypical ways that despair of the office of minister or of pastor. Most children who grow up and they're asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? They don't instantaneously think, I want to be a pastor, because to be a pastor often means to bear reproaches of the world. Even as Paul noted, all of his great sufferings that he endured as a gospel or as a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So in the culture in which we live, there's a lot of disrespect for pastors. And I think consciously, perhaps even more subconsciously, this disrespect can easily creep into the church, where people disparage of the office of minister, where they make jokes about the office of minister and what it is to be a pastor. And we ought to think highly and think long about how Paul characterizes the minister in the different titles, as Owen notes for us. But it's also useful for pastors to remember that in following the example of the Apostle Paul, that rarely did Paul ever demand the respect of his congregation. You remember a couple lessons ago that we looked at Timothy, and Paul gives Timothy a charge in 1 Timothy 4:12, that Timothy was likely dealing with a church that wasn't honoring or respecting him, that they were actually looking down on him because of his age, because of his inexperience. Perhaps he had let the ball drop a couple too many times. You don't know the particular circumstances of why people were looking down. But Paul, as he writes to Timothy, he doesn't tell Timothy, you better put your church in order, and you better make sure that they're respecting you and honoring you. But rather, Paul's command is to Timothy, and he tells Timothy, this burden is on you. You can't let anyone look down on you, but you must set the example for believers. So as Paul deals with Timothy, who is a struggling pastor, who is being looked down upon and not honored in the way that was becoming of a minister, Paul's primary burden there in 1 Timothy 4:12 is to speak to Timothy and to say, you need to make sure that you're not giving anybody a reason to look down on you, but setting an example for believers. We see this as well as Paul deals with his good friend Philemon. Remember that in the book of Philemon, that Onesimus has run away. He was a slave of Philemon's, and he runs into Paul, and he converts and becomes a Christian under the ministry of Paul. And you remember that as Paul is writing to Philemon, that he's imploring Philemon to free Onesimus, to see that Onesimus may have once been a slave, but now he is a brother. And you remember that line that Paul uses with Philemon, that he essentially says, listen, I'm an apostle, and I could just command you and tell you what you're supposed to do. But he said, but that's not my objective in this. And he says, rather, I want you, of your own volition, to free Onesimus. I want to appeal to your love and to your kindness and to the respect that you have. Right now, Philemon, you know you owe me your life. But I'm not going to call this debt up right now. And I am going to rather try to compel you, to woo you to let Onesimus go. And so we see this pattern in Paul, that even though he esteems and he notes all these different titles of how a pastor ought to be esteemed, rarely, if ever, in the New Testament does Paul say, well, ministers, you ought to demand this. Right? But rather that we compel people through our actions, through our love, through our sincerity, that we continue on in a lot of patience, hoping that this will result in people respecting the office of the minister. But this also is important for congregants to know that though we are to respect our pastors, that this doesn't mean that you are to see your pastor as something like the vicar of Christ, again, in the way that the Roman Catholic Church views the Pope. All right, there is a sense in which pastors can be given an undue amount of respect. And that is not what that is not what Owen is calling us to. Not to think that pastors simply walk on water, or that they are inerrant or infallible in all that they declare. All right, we already dealt in a previous lesson that if your pastor is in sin, all right, that if you can't genuinely overlook that in love, that you can confront him in love. All right, pastors are men, they are fallible men. All right, that they are, what's that old saying that I've heard, right, that even the best of men are men at best. And we need to always keep that in mind. Right, so this isn't wholehearted, blind respect and honor in all matters. But we can't fall off the horse on the other side and say, well, that means we don't need to respect them at all. Really, what Owen is getting at, what Paul gets at, is that we are to render a proper amount of respect and honor to those who are in positions and authority over us. That we respect that out of respect for the one, that is God, who has established them as authorities. And so as you think of this, right, what are some ways that you can respect your pastor? Well, you think, chiefly be in prayer for him, as we noted in our last lesson. Be an encouragement to him. Don't be a thorn in his flesh. Right? Don't think that your spiritual gift is the gift of criticism. Sometimes it's thrown around as a joke. I know I've thrown that around as myself as well, right? That I'm gifted at criticizing people. Don't think that your job is to always criticize and to always give constructive criticism. Know the pastors bear a lot of that. The pastors are very aware of their own weaknesses and insufficiencies. All right, but in other ways, you can respect your pastor in the way that you think about him. All right, in the way that you speak about him, particularly to others. Do you esteem his role? Do you show forth with your words that you honor him and that you appreciate him? Do you defer to his opinion and preferences and things and in matters? All right, are you the type of member that you think, well, everything has to go my way? Or are you willing to defer in brotherly love and affection to those that earn authority over you? All right, trust your pastor. Sometimes even I hear this, that I'm just too young and that people can't really trust me, that I'm just too inexperienced in these things. But I think, right, and then we can often hear, I know I've heard this a lot, right, that you have to earn my respect, that it's not deserved. And in some degree, that's true. But in another degree, as he is your pastor, as the church has called him to serve as the pastor, as you have willingly and gladly agreed to submit to him as a pastor, as you have verified the gifts and the graces that God has given to him, then hopefully you can have an element of trust. Hopefully you can trust him and confide in him and take counsel from him. All right, so in all of these ways, we have the opportunity to respect our authorities. You have the opportunity to respect your pastors and your elders. So the fourth rule that Owen gives to us as it relates to how congregations deal with their pastors is he says believers are to hold the pastor in the greatest respect and to submit to him for the work's sake. Well, I hope this lesson has been profitable, and I look forward to you tuning in to the next one. Thank you.